Hi, everybody. I'm Kara Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA School of Law, and welcome to our webinar. I want to first thank the Center on Reproductive Health, Law, and Policy for organizing this really interesting series on various aspects of questions about reproductive justice. And I especially want to thank our two fabulous panelists who are going to be in discussion with me today on the intersection of reproductive health, health justice, and environmental justice. First, I want to introduce Lindsay Wiley. Many of you may know Professor Wiley. She's professor of law here at UCLA Law. She's also the faculty director of our Health Law and Policy program. Among other things, she is the author of the forthcoming book, Feminist Judgments, Health Law Rewritten, which I personally can't wait to read. She's also written about the intersection of health justice and environmental justice, and she's at the forefront of scholars really working to reframe and reconceptualize questions of health justice, especially post-Roe. And then I want to especially thank our second panelist today, who is Christine Cordero. She's the co-director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, or APEN, where she organizes with immigrants and refugees, among others, for a healthy environment and for a thriving economy for all communities. She's worked for more than 20 years to build coalitions across social and racial justice advocacy movements. And I'm especially excited to hear her thoughts on the intersections that we'll be discussing today. And with that, I'm happy to jump in with some sort of framing questions. And I'm going to open the discussion with maybe the broadest framing question of all, which is, what does the term reproductive justice mean to each of you? And what do advocates in this field really work for when they work for reproductive justice? And I'm happy to start with you, Lindsay, and then I'll turn to Christine for her answer as well.
So I'm so excited that Christine in particular could join us for this event. Christine joined us as a commentator at a workshop on health justice that we hosted here at UCLA last October, but that was not, broadly open to the public or to our students even. And so I'm just so excited for you all to hear from Christine today. I'll just briefly start us off by saying that in my work on the intersection of health justice, reproductive justice, environmental justice, I follow the sister song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collaborative, which is a network of more than 80 grassroots organizations that in many ways led the initial framing of the reproductive justice movement. And the Sister Song Collaborative defines reproductive justice in terms of three rights: the right to have children, which is one thing that distinguishes reproductive justice from, a sort of narrow framing around the right to choose abortion; the right not to have children, which includes obviously abortion and contraception, but also empowerment of people who are capable of becoming pregnant to control their reproduction in ways beyond just sort of access to reproductive health care, and the right to parent the children we have in safe and healthy environments. And I think that's really key for me, that last point, to the connection between a kind of broader vision of health and well-being that's present in the reproductive justice framing as opposed to reproductive rights, and environmental justice as a key linkage between reproductive justice and health justice.
Thanks, Lindsay. Christine, you want to add anything? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, Kara and Lindsay, and greetings, everyone. Apologies, we can't see your face. I'm calling in from Lishan Ohlone territory, aka Oakland, California. And I'm going to talk more about APEN in a little bit, but to your question of what does reproductive justice mean, I think I want to go back to, I've been working at the intersection of environmental justice, health, and economy for a really long time. And I think the first time I really understood reproductive justice was in the context of visiting the Philippines. So my family is originally from the Philippines, but I was born and raised here in the States. And I, at some point in my college years, was into kind of looking into my identity and trying to understand the connections between the United States and the Philippines. And so I ended up working with this group called FACES, Filipino American Coalition for Environmental Solidarity. And at that time, we were working on the toxic waste left over by the US military in communities in the Philippines. And we were in a community called Angeles outside of the Clark Air Force Base, former Clark Air Force Base, not too far actually from where my parents grew up. And I was asked to do interpretation to English for some of the non-Tagalog or local language speaking participants. And we visited one house and we talked to all mothers. And at the first house, she talked about having her baby in this neighborhood. And she introduced us to her now 6-year-old at that time, and he had congenital heart disease. We went to the next house. We talked to another mother, and her child had autism from a very early age. We went to the next house. You get where I'm going. Next house. And it dawned on me slowly and slowly. It was like, oh, environmental justice, as I understood at the time, is that everyone deserves clean air, sweet water, a stable climate, where you live, work, play, pray, or worship, and eventually where you can thrive. And I remember on that trip being like, the first environment is the womb. And what does it mean to provide a healthy environment for life as it enters into what we currently understand as environment? So I actually am very aligned with Lindsay in that the way we see reproductive justice, or how I understand it within the environmental justice context, is the places where we give life, whether that's on the land or in the bodies that can create life, is also the place where you have the most vulnerable environments, and where you can see the impacts of injustice. So that'll happen on birth outcomes, right? Health outcomes, in addition to once a human life has left the womb, what they have access to for their health. And that's when you're looking at environmental justice communities that have health disparities of 15 to 20-year life expectancy difference based on their environments as they grow up. So I would say very aligned with Lindsay, understanding that for a lot of us in environmental justice, or I'll speak for myself, they don't seem very different. It's just reproductive justice is a focus for us within environmental justice. And I came into environmental justice work really understanding toxic chemicals because I grew up in Pittsburgh, California, which is in Contra Costa County with 5 refineries, multiple power plants, and right next to a chemical plant. So when you talk about reproductive justice, it is just like right there with environmental justice. I'll stop there.
Thanks. I love that focus on the places where we give life. I love that phrase. And your answer actually begins to take us in the direction where I wanted to head next anyway, which is to invite you to talk a little bit about your practice at APEN, the work that you do with communities, and the places where this focus on environmental justice and reproductive justice really shows up in that work.
Awesome, happy to. So APEN, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, for those that are not familiar, we're a 30-year-old organization, environmental justice organization that has been primarily based out of Richmond, California, which has, I believe, the state's largest refinery that's over 100 years old, as well as Oakland, Chinatown, where there is a longstanding Chinese in language speaking community, ethnic enclave, if you will, a beautiful jewel of Oakland that are full of folks who are impacted by, for instance, the nearby port and the freeways, as well as displacement, with a very ethnically rich place. And then more recently, we are going to launch a new chapter in Wilmington, San Pedro area, very close to where y'all are.
I did not know this.
Congratulations. Yeah, and a statewide membership. So, we have for the last several decades understood that this is a very unique intersection that we sit at around building Asian American and Asian immigrant power for environmental justice and thriving communities and a thriving economy. And so APEN really, that aha with reproductive justice and how it shows up in the work is largely, I think even in the original founding in Richmond, it started originally, Laotian immigrant refugees had been displaced to many different places from the Vietnam War prior to immigrating to Richmond, California, and started to kind of congregate as what happens with immigrant families who are looking to build community and safety in a completely different place. And the Laotian immigrant refugee community had no idea that they were living next to this huge refinery and that Richmond had 350 different toxic hotspots in a very small city that even right now, I believe is 80,000 population. And it started because a lot of the Laotian immigrant refugees are actually, farmers. They're close to the land. And so they started to see the effects of toxics in the food and their crops, kind of what they grew. And then one of the earliest APEN projects was with Laotian young women, high school and college age, who started to ask around in their families about health, about food, and about environment. And they started to notice patterns. And so, how reproductive justice shows up, I feel like in our community, is understanding where do the things in our environment actually impact our ability to live life in a thriving generative way. I would say the second way is to the third point of Lindsay's definition of how to recreate environments and communities where life can thrive, and how do we make sure that everyone has access to that type of community. So the other way that this is showing up on our work, in addition to thinking about things like how do you transition a refinery justly for the workers in the frontline communities? How do you transition this whole state off of fossil fuels when we know it's killing the planet and the people, and it is no longer tenable, right? And what does it mean to get to this clean, green economy where we are not trying to live right next door to all the stuff that does not allow life to thrive? And that actually the disparities that have been caused by environmental injustice are only exacerbated by climate injustice. And so we also talk about what does it look like if we understand that the current economy, which is how we organize society, how we distribute resources, is actually geared towards domination, towards extraction, towards take. For us, when we say, what does a regenerative economy look like? We're very intentional at APEN about naming that we think that's a feminist economy, because the current economy does not put fem-identified things, including Mother Earth, as things that should be sacred or valued equally, right? So when we say a feminist economy and a regenerative economy, we're saying, what does it look like to value life across the board, regardless of who you are or what you look like, in a way that actually life can thrive and puts life and human and relative life. When I say relatives, I mean it in the indigenous, and the way our indigenous allies and partners tell us, all living beings, is what does it look like to center the living part in this feminist economy? And so, at APEN, we've talked a lot about what does nourish and care as baseline values of an economy look like? What does it mean to look at not just what is considered labor, but also the labor that makes labor happen, or reproductive labor? So when we talk about reproductive justice, we're thinking about it in the most expansive sense. In that way. And that's kind of how it shows up. And ultimately, and this is where I think it links back to more traditional reproductive justice issues as people understand it, is I think a main concept that crosses is sovereignty. Sovereignty of land, sovereignty of bodies, sovereignty of communities, to understand how nothing about us can happen without us. And this, if we took that principle across the board, if that were an undergirding value of our economy, what would it look like? Who would be protected? Who would get to thrive in that economy? So our work often has looked all the way from, traditional energy issues to a lot around public safety and housing, to what it looks like to have housing that's community owned so that folks don't get displaced and they could keep their intergenerational kind of bonds linked to place and each other. What does it look like to have, for instance, now in the changing climate resiliency hubs where people can weather the climate and displacement threats in a place that's right in their own neighborhood? So these are just a few examples of how it shows up in our work. And I will take a break there to let Lindsay come in.
Thanks so much. Lindsay, is there anything you want to add? I know you've been talking and writing about these linkages for quite a while.
Yeah, so I'm just so inspired by the work that Christine is doing at APEN and that other organizations are doing, particularly based here in California. One of the things I'm so excited about my move from the DC area to UCLA is just the opportunity to engage in this kind of state and local advocacy and community-focused advocacy work that's really driven by the expressed needs of community. So my research and teaching interests focus on, the way I describe it to avoid just saying I'm a health law scholar is to say I focus on access to healthcare and healthy living conditions in the US and globally. So that's like a little bit of a hegemonic view of health. I'm like, I try to do a lot of things. Early on in my career, when I was trying to kind of think about how to combine my interests, I worked particularly on issues relating to climate and health. And I wrote a lot about how international climate change law and the phenomenon of environmental change and degradation might influence the evolution of global health law and public health law, all the way from global to local, because these are fields, global health, public health, that have historically been really driven by a security agenda. And security is a mushy word that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, right? It can mean kind of like well-being in the sense of food security or housing security, but it can also mean sort of like protecting privileged people from threats that are often perceived to emerge from people who have been socially subordinated. So thinking about climate, thinking about principles like common but differentiated responsibility and just transition, and how those principles might extend kind of beyond the climate change mitigation context where they first emerged to influence our thinking about adaptation, and then even more broadly, other spheres and issues. You know, for me, that includes things like benefit sharing in global health governance regimes, things like access to medicines, access to vaccines that are very much being negotiated right now in the pandemic treaty negotiations. So I'm thrilled to see that common but differentiated responsibility as a principle drawn from climate change is like really actively influencing these discussions in the global health community. A lot of my current work focuses on health justice as a framework both for health law scholarship and community advocacy. And I see that as a framework that builds bridges across sectors like healthcare and public health, environmental protection, labor and employment, education, transportation, food systems, immigration, and criminal law. And in developing my vision about, of what health justice requires from me as a kind of scholar advocate in terms of principles and practices, I rely really heavily on insights drawn from movements that preceded health justice, like reproductive justice, environmental justice, and food justice movements and organizations. And one of the things that really struck me is that these movements have always been interrelated. They're not really fully disparate movements, in the sense that Christine, was conveying as well from her work. From its inception, the reproductive justice movement has been, explicitly globally conscious and explicitly tied to the environmental justice movement. So I just want to say that although the kind of term reproductive justice and the emphasis on experiences of women of color in the United States as part of that kind of emerged as a critique from within the US pro-choice movement. Loretta Ross, who's a key figure in that movement and still kind of an active speaker and scholar and advocate in these spaces. She was a really fantastic speaker at the American Public Health Association's annual conference just last fall. She's a key figure in the reproductive justice movement, and she, in her work, has traced the movement's roots to a 1994 international conference on population and development that was held in Cairo. So I see this as, and she describes this as kind of a key common root or origin story. That 1994 conference was explicitly given a broader mandate on development issues than any previous population conference had been, reflecting growing awareness that population, poverty, patterns of production and consumption, and the environment are so closely interconnected that we really can't consider them in isolation if we're thinking about movement building or if we're thinking about policy change. So the program of action that arose out of that Cairo meeting recognized reproductive health as a human right. That was a key moment in international recognition of reproductive health as a human right. It also recognized gender equality, empowerment of women, and equal access to education for girls as sustainable development priorities. As Christine pointed out, environmental degradation and exposures to environmental toxins fall disproportionately on women, on people who are pregnant, on the children they're raising, because of all of the impacts on fertility, on fetal development, on infant mortality, on child development. But I also want to say that although these connections are like inspiring and exciting and generative of new thinking, I think we also have to be wary of this 1994 moment and this kind of common root in thinking about development, sustainable development, because there are eugenicist roots in some of these connections between environment, health, and reproduction. So there's kind of a Malthusian influence here, the idea that overpopulation, often used as kind of a euphemism for the real concern of kind of high birth rates among women living in low resource settings in particular, that's a key driver of environmental degradation, is sort of just beneath the surface in these discussions. And so for me, that's why it's so critical in these discussions to maintain a strong focus on justice in its multiple dimensions, right? Participatory justice and the power of communities to define and achieve the conditions they need to thrive. Distributive justice in terms of thinking, careful attention to how the burdens and benefits of government intervention and the burdens and benefits of public investments in these sectors are distributed across individuals and groups. And I think also justice as recognition to ensure that interventions that kind of in a surface way are aimed at ameliorating the impacts of inequality aren't actually influenced by biased ideas about what people need, what's best for them, and what people are capable of. So I think it's really important to balance these considerations and be conscious of and always recognizing the tension with some of the roots in these connections between environmental protection and reproduction.
Thanks, Lizzie. Wow, there's so much here. This is such a rich discussion. I really deeply appreciate the way that you both are articulating ambitious, wide-ranging visions for where we as a society should head that take in justice of various sorts. And it's really reminding me of many of the ways that environmental advocates in recent years have begun to broaden their conception of what it is we should be doing as environmental advocates to include a wider set of social and racial and economic justice goals than environmental advocates have typically considered to own. And I'm thinking particularly of the Green New Deal here. And I wonder if you each would be willing to speak a little bit to what you think of that sort of trend in environmental advocacy. It sounds like you both recognize really deep advantages to broadening one's sense of how one achieves justice across a range of necessarily interrelated domains. I wonder if there are also, and Lindsay, you also mentioned at least maybe one potential downside or tension in linking some of these ideas together. I have heard from folks sometimes thoughts along the following lines. Oh, if we try to kind of fix everything at once, it seems overwhelming and hard, and maybe that's too much of an agenda to take on. I wonder what your sort of response is to that sort of reaction from either or both of you. Maybe we'll start with you, Christine. I'll just call on you to make the ordering easier.
Thank you for that, Cara. I mean, this is Lindsay. I was like, yes. If anything, I think where I want to start, and I'll get to your question, Cara, is Lindsay, I think this evolution you beautifully described around reproductive health and justice. And I feel like there's a similar kind of trend or evolution you could see in environmental justice and climate justice, right? Where the focuses are on certain things at certain times. And over time it evolved and it got broader and broader. And I really appreciated your warning around, like, there are some eugenic underpinnings to some of the arguments that are currently happening, right? So in environmental justice and climate, at first it was like admitting that it was true. It was like, it's happening, right? Like in both environmental justice and climate, right? That human activity driven climate change was happening. And then there was like a section where it was all about like polar bears and carbon emissions. Well, some people are still on carbon emissions, right? Polar bears and carbon emissions. I think there was a very intentional move specifically from environmental justice frontline communities to move it from polar bears, who we love. We love our charismatic megafauna, but to also like, hey, this has real human community effects, to adaptation, to resiliency, as you said. And ultimately for us, like when we talk about the framework that we brought in where I met Lindsay was this concept of just transition, that we are moving from systems that have greatly harmed the planet and the people, don't work for vast majority of people, to what does it look like to build a regenerative set of economy or economies that actually work, that are appropriate to people and place, and understanding that the world is actually quite diverse. And so to the mythology that overpopulation is the driving force, right, around environmental degradation, I mean, it doesn't even stand up to I think you could do a high school research project on it and know that emissions as related to that is not at all, it's a red herring when you're looking at these arguments. And so really appreciating, Lindsay, your breakdown of that and being like, ultimately, I think some of the more, to your question, Cara, around to the people that are like, well, we can't do everything all at once. and overwhelmed. It's like, well, no one is saying that one. Two, on some ways, that is kind of the call of our time, is like, there were 100 different ways we destroyed this planet. And why I do mean a collective we, but there is, when you look at GHG emissions, corporate and industrial entities make up for the largest portion of who has done this work, right? That there is actually a set of solutions that have been out there for quite some time. And what does it look like to create solutions in place that actually are doable, right? So for us at APEN, a lot of times we're talking about, listen, humans have done incredible things like put a library on a grain of sand. Like, the idea that we cannot do this to save our home planet, to me is like, well, we can do that. But I've also heard, I wish I could remember the quote, hope is a discipline. Hope is a discipline. And this is like talking about survival of our species. It's like, there is a way in which we have solved very complicated social issues in the past, and we can do so again. And that fatalism is only going to get you so far, and you actually have to keep going at the problem, right, in ways that make sense. And a few of the warnings I would say to add to what Lindsay is talking about is, when you only go at this problem as a carbon emission problem, or GHG, and reduction, when you reduce anything, right, to this one quantifiable thing, you're not going to get to actual solutions that work for communities. Because when you look at geography, when you look at socioeconomic conditions of a place, you're not going to be able to do a one size fits all for every place. And I think being able to address the disparities of who causes a lot of this, in addition, who will bear the burden for the impacts of it, are important things that we need to look at. And that there is tons of the information is not the problem, the political will is. And so, putting together and breaking down these silos of we've been taught to put issues kind of and try to treat them one by one. It's like throwing a bunch of different band-aids that look slightly different without actually talking about what's the root cause of the wound, right, that we're talking about. And so I think, in addition to the Loretta Ross quote that Lindsay put up here, we often go by the Combahee River collective statement, where it's like, major systems of oppression are interlocking. Like, when you try to address a system at one point, like, it doesn't actually work. And so I would say there is a whole range of actions that can be taken from the individual consumer. And I'm not the environmentalist that says don't do it. I will be the one that says it's not enough and you can't buy your way out of this problem. However, I feel like the actions that people do that give them hope on a daily basis, again, hope is a discipline, and when we feel our own agency, you can move that person from recycling something to maybe they'll call an elected official. Maybe they'll get involved in their APEN, right? Maybe they'll understand where their water comes from. Maybe they'll look at what their economy is actually made of, and then be able to do something out. For me, it's like a spectrum of things that can be done that go all the way from individual action all the way to, kind of the UN solutions that we've been trying to get to. And we have to be careful about trying to flatten that just because we're saying everybody should do something, it doesn't mean everybody should do the same thing. So I'll stop there. I know it's a lot.
That's so important. And I just right off the bat, I have to share that your last comment about kind of that incremental movement for individual consumers and voters and community members just really resonates with me too. I mean, I'm now, to my shock, a parent of teenagers and young adults, and just watching the way that they move, from like bar shampoo to save on waste, to like, I want to incorporate social justice into my art practice and into my life and into the choices I make as a voter and as a communicator out in the world of ideas. And it's just really exciting to see that. And so, I agree, like sometimes these things that are described as distractions can actually be stepping stones. Christine and I should say, we just met within the last year, but we were introduced by a mutual friend, Aisha Pamuko. And it just feels like we should have met decades ago. But, one of the things that I wrote, and one of the very first law review articles I wrote as like a baby law professor trying to get my first job, started out with this idea that, polar bears aren't the face of climate change. That the face of climate change is, a toddler dying of diarrheal illness. The face of climate change is a school-age kid who, is missing school days, missing childhood experiences because their asthma is out of control. And the parents who are watching this happen and feeling like the power to protect their children is being stripped from them and taken by corporate interests, taken by people with privilege who aren't experiencing those effects on in a direct way or on a day-to-day basis. So I think, Kara, your point about this kind of like downside or objection, I want to make that really concrete in the spaces that I work in. So, public health law is very much a contested field. There's contestation about the legitimate scope of what counts as a public health problem. And I do a lot of work about that. A lot of what I focus on is just what is the legitimate scope of what counts as a public health problem. One set of objections is really kind of quick to be made and like, I'm not that interested in it because I don't agree with its premise. And that's a libertarian objection, that when you label something a health threat, it puts like an extra thumb on the scale of legitimacy of government intervention. I agree, and I'm excited about that. So I'm not as interested in engaging with that libertarian objection, that this is going to, be contrary to individual freedom. But there's another objection that's very different that I've labeled the progressive objection. And this is the objection that I get from people within the field who say, look, I care about racial justice. I care about economic justice. I care about labor and employment. I care about the, criminal injustice in our system. But those, like, yes, I care about them, but what is added by thinking about those things as connected to what I do in health law or health advocacy? So what, right? Like, beyond just health being a reason to care about these issues, like climate change, like environmental racism, what is added by thinking about these as connected to health or thinking about these issues as connected to reproduction? And I think for me, the pandemic was really a turning point that for me just kind of hammered the nail into the coffin of that objection. The idea that we can silo off these different movements, these different reform efforts, these different issues, and treat them separately with distinct expertise just is untenable, I think, at this point. Housing and environmental exposures and exposure to to the criminal justice system and immigration and transportation and reproduction and healthcare, these are all intimately interconnected in our daily lives. The other kind of concrete example here that I'll give, just to bring this back to law for a primarily law student audience, is that the connections across sectors are very much seen by people with a deregulatory agenda. Groups, lawyers, organizations who are seeking to dismantle the administrative state very much understand the power of cross-sector advocacy. There are these cross-cutting issues that really unite efforts around reproduction, around environment, around health, things like preemption of local authority to define what's needed and make it a reality. Things like federalism and separation of powers and administrative law constraints, things like corporate entities asserting individual rights in a deregulatory way, things like the Supreme Court's new major questions doctrine that ties the hands of agencies to kind of rise to new challenges using broadly defined grants of authority from the legislature. But ultimately, I think this kind of cross-sector work and the need for it arises out of community organizations and what they're telling us about lived experience. So there are kind of pragmatic lawyerly reasons that this works. And there are, if you respect what you're hearing from community and what you're hearing from lived experience, it's the only way that we can proceed.
Thanks to both of you for those answers. So at this point, I want to note for our participants that we have a Q&A, and I want to encourage you to drop questions in the Q&A if you have them. And I see here that we actually have our first. So I'm going to pause my list of questions to entertain the one that's in the Q&A right now, which I'm happy to read in case everyone can't see it. So the question is regulatory law sufficiently accessible or effective to achieve reproductive environmental justice? So to your point, Lindsay, I guess this is a panel in part for lawyers and law students. So let's talk about what law can do about these problems. The questioner asks, what are some key changes in the law that you would recommend at the state or federal level to make it more accessible or effective to address these problems we've been talking about? Maybe I'll start with you, Lindsay, and then we'll go to Christine.
I actually want to start with Christine on this one.
Okay.
Because I have views
Great.
that I'll share, but I want to hear Christine's perspective
Christine.
on the role of law and lawyers first.
Oh, well, one, no. Well, okay, sorry. I really don't mean to be facetious, but a couple of things I want to, there is a fantastic new effort coming out of the South called the Just Transition Lawyering Institute. Lindsay, I don't know if you're plugged in with those folks, Colette Pinchon-Battle, who's amazing. I also dropped in a link. This is such a huge, rich ecosystem of groups, like APEN is one of many working on the issues we're talking about. But to Kennedy's question, is regulatory law sufficiently accessible or effective to achieve reproductive environmental justice? I can answer mostly on the environmental justice side. The answer is no. And the reason being, a lot of the law was set up either in context to when it was made, and then context changed, or they were set up specifically in ways that that gave corporations more rights than communities or people, or put the burden on people to prove the harm. So a lot of, for instance, toxic chemical law, right? You had post-World War II trying to get the economy to grow. You had tens of thousands of chemicals that were grandfathered in, just got completely approved across the board, with no real understanding of what the short-term or long-term health impacts would be of much of those chemicals, including things that we know now are like lead and other heavy metals that are incredibly toxic, right, to environmental and reproductive health. And so still to this day, the way that chemical law is set up, and Lindsay, hope you could back me up, I'm not a trained lawyer. This is what I understand from my 20 years of work, is that it is still on those of us who are being harmed to prove that there's a link between the chemicals and the health outcomes, which, by the way, you cannot, it is very difficult to prove causation, but we have been somewhat successful in proving correlation, which will often get us to the regulatory laws that we need. But still to this day, the burden is put on either the consumer or the person that is the downstream impacted person or communities to prove it. So things are just, it's kind of like this it's just a live experiment on the chemical front for the way that those laws are set up around toxics. For environmental justice law, you have things, there was like a whole suite of environmental regulations that were passed. I can't remember, was it Lyndon B. Johnson who passed them? There was a whole suite of like Clean Air Act, those things that passed.
Nixon.
Yes, Nixon. Was it Nixon? Wow. Okay, all right, we'll give him some credit for something, right? So when those laws were passed, that we are still then trying to defend, when you had a whole deregulation period in the 80s with Reagan, then a lot of this stuff got undone, and or they started overwriting a lot of these laws. And so a lot of the environmental protection laws have been so watered down, they're so bureaucratic, that is so difficult as a community to really navigate these bureaucratic ways to do it. That being said, we still have amazing partners, for instance, like Communities for a Better Environment, who have a legal wing that has done a ton about trying to understand what are the legal handles we have as communities to protect ourselves, in addition to, to fight for and before something is zoned into our neighborhood, right? Or to be like, hey, something nasty is coming out of that smokestack, and we don't need to be scientists to tell you to stop, to tell you what it's doing. So there are ways in which we have been navigating the imperfect system to make the law work for us, but for the most part, it is not pro-community regulatory laws out here. It is definitely pro-corporation or pro-profit, frankly, and puts the burden on those of us that generally have not had access to these systems to figure out how to navigate, how to make the law work for us. So I imagine, Lindsay, you have way more on this, but that's how I'll say how it feels on the community end.
I think it was really important to start with that. And I think, I think for law students who are in this space, for lawyers who are in this space, for law professors who are in this space, one of the things we have to grapple with is, what is our role? And how do we partner with community or be led by community, as opposed to coming in with kind of top-down solutions, which tends to be the way that like our training prepares us to work in these spaces. One of the things, when I was trying to think about what health justice might mean as a legal scholarship framework, one of the lessons that I pulled out of environmental justice and reproductive justice is the role of lawyers is carefully navigated, carefully considered. And that's different. That's one of the things that sets these justice-oriented movements apart from just environmental protection or reproductive rights. The different experience of what lawyering in these movements looks like. I think, on the really just reproductive rights and access to reproductive healthcare point, I also wanted to respond to this question by saying that one of the roles, I think, for lawyers in this particular moment, when it's the landscape, the legal landscape is so dynamic and so rapidly changing with the changed composition of the federal bench in particular, one of the roles for lawyers in this moment is to communicate in the clearest possible terms what is at stake in some of these seemingly arcane, seemingly narrow, kind of proceduralist debates, to be able to partner with community organizations and advocacy groups to say, listen, this thing that's happening in this West Virginia case about the Clean Air Act, that is the same thing that's happening on the public health side when we're thinking about testing, and vaccination, and when we're thinking about the eviction moratorium during the pandemic. These are the same. The judges understand them to be the same. The legal developments are playing off of each other. And, when you just say major questions doctrine or most favored nation status for religious objectors or whatever, language that we learn as lawyers, that doesn't always convey what's at stake. And it's difficult to then communicate to the broader public, like this is how these decisions that are being made in the court, decisions that are also being made in legislatures and in state legislatures and state courts, how they're affecting people's everyday lives is harder and harder to communicate in this environment, and more vital as something that we with legal training, are equipped to do. But I'm thinking more and more in my courses that I teach about how to emphasize that skill of translation of stakes in particular on these issues.
Thanks, Lindsay. That's super helpful. Christine, I wonder if you want to say a few more words about how you like to work with lawyers, particularly with our law school students in mind. I realize there's a long and rich history of lawyers doing harms to community by coming in with all of our fancy training and in many ways trying our best to help those communities, but in fact disempowering them in all the ways that lawyers sometimes do. And I wonder if you have lessons that you'd like our law school students to hear as you think about how lawyers can be helpful in the work that you do.
Thank you for that, Cara. Thank you, Carly, who's been doing an amazing job. I keep shooting her all these resources just to try to make the most of our time together. One of my former mentors, I quoted in the chat, Luke Cole, used to always say lawyers on tap, not on top. And I also used to work at a place called Center for Environmental Health, which is where a lot of my experience on environmental health and toxics come from. And we used to use California's Proposition 65 law, or they still do at CEH, in order to try all kinds of different cases. And one of the things I always used to tell our lawyers, and I also used to teach a class for public policy folks and public health folks, is a lot of what I encourage folks to do as folks want to, and we appreciate folks wanting to do well and wanting to contribute for a lot of folks back to their communities who might come from EJ frontline communities or care about the environment or health, a number of things, and want to give back, which is a fantastic way to figure out how to get in. I tell folks, first, do your homework. Don't come to a community only when you need something. Like, what does it mean if you think about building a friendship or building a relationship, think about it in that way. It's like, you actually sometimes just have to show up and listen without getting anything in return for a while before then you set up to make an ask, right? So a lot of the time I tell folks is like, sometimes you just got to go show up. You got to visit, you got to shut up and listen before you start to try to understand how you're going to apply the expertise that you went to school for or whatnot to do. So it's kind of, in direct action, we call this an OODA loop, which is that you observe, then you orient, and then you decide what to do, and then you act. I tell folks you can do an OODA loop in you can do it in a minute, all the way to several years. And when we used to build relationships between our lawyers, the researchers, a lot of any academic researchers, public policy and public health people, I would tell folks, think about this as an ongoing relationship. Think about how you're going to reach out in a way that actually builds with people in the long term, and or frankly, just be honest if it's a transaction. So if it's not going to be a transformational relationship, then the next best thing is to be really clear about how you're coming in with or without resources in communities that are largely invested in or have been deliberately left out of the process, right? So what this means for how you balance power dynamics when entering any of these situations, I think is really important. And for a lot of us, you're going to be coming in with a lot of educational privilege, but also there's a ton of community expertise that you do not have. So I remember, for instance, there was a case I did, unfortunately, around the Exide battery facility that is now in like terrible, terrible legal limbo for cleanup because of how that happened. And I remember we had a lawyer who wanted to put an air monitor on somebody's house and was like, hey, hey, CEH and Center for Environmental Health is out in the Bay. And they're like, you know, can you give us an address or somebody who let us put an air monitor up on the house? And we were like, do you know anybody who lives there? I was like, there's at least 2 community environmental justice groups that have been working on this facility for several years. Like, have you talked to them? And there was like oh, you know, and I was like, basic homework, like the internet is a beautiful thing. So I would say those are some of the basic things I say. Do your homework, build a relationship for the long term, and or be honest and be ready to come balancing power dynamics. So I would say if you stick to that as a baseline, you're going to be probably far ahead of a lot of folks who will continue to act in extractive ways, because that's been the dominant culture of academia with communities. And so I think that's been changing a ton over the last, especially several decades that I've been involved with the work. Like, community-based stuff has largely evolved, and we will still see some of those dynamics like literally like yesterday saw it happen, right? So I hope that's concrete enough, but also leaves enough room. I also was putting in resources there's a ton of resources for folks about how to do this work. There have been a lot of people who've been trying to do this work really well for a long time.
Thanks so much. Super helpful. Also a big fan of Luke Cole and his work. So I'll make a last call for questions in the chat. If people want to add them in, now's your moment. Because otherwise I'm going to start turning to what I think of as my wrap-up questions with this incredible set of panelists we have with us today. I'm particularly interested in hearing where you each see the most promise for heading next for folks working at this intersection. And I realize that's a super vague, probably unfair question, but I really intend to leave you a lot of leeway to talk about what makes you excited about next steps in this movement, you know, for you, for your organization, really for all of us who want to help. And Lindsay, why don't we start with you, and then we'll give maybe Christine the last word.
Yeah, I definitely want to give, I was tempted to let Christine go first, but here I'll give her last word. So I'm going to be honest, I struggle to find those moments of optimism in these spaces right now. I think a lot of us do. There are a couple of things I'll point to that are important moments of change, one at the global level and one at the national level. So at the global level, I just want to urge anyone who cares about environmental justice and climate justice to have their eyes on the pandemic treaty negotiations, and particular on the aspects of those negotiations that relate to sample and benefit sharing. So thinking about access to medicines, access to vaccines, access to diagnostics beyond the countries where those resources are produced most immediately, and for everyone based on need rather than ability to pay. Another moment, you know, coming up at the national level is renegotiation of the Farm Bill, is a really critical, you know, concrete area where food and environment and health and families and children and women and their needs are negotiated. The Farm Bill isn't just farm subsidies, although it is farm subsidies, and also subsidies for fresh and appealing produce, in addition to thinking about balancing out, subsidies for things like oilseed commodity crops. It's also where the WIC program, the SNAP program for nutrition assistance, are renegotiated each year. And these notions of like deservingness come up again and again in those negotiations, these ideas about sort of who is it justifiable for us to provide this kind of assistance to. So I'll just say more broadly, these are both opportunities among many to center collective action in response to collective needs, and to center our kind of mutual interdependence, and the idea that just as you can't silo off these different sectors of our experience in life, you can't silo off the challenges that some members of our community are facing from what our entire community needs to thrive.
Thanks, Lindsay. Christine, on to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm feeling you on the, it's a struggle on a day-to-day basis, because it's something some of our friends over Movement Generation used to, they say in a lot of their political education around like the evolution of environmental work and just, citizen action work is like, if you think about the effort it took to get us to where we are, and the hands working in opposition to our values, how do we reconsider humanity as a keystone species? For those of us that remember kind of high school biology, and this idea of like the point is not for us to actually disengage and let nature do its thing. It's like we are nature, and we're a keystone species of that fact. And so if I were to say where I gain hope is that everywhere from artists to organizers to lawyers, I've been telling people like where we are, as Grace Lee Boggs used to say on the clock of the world, she used to say, what time is it on the clock of the world? Is like for those of us to understand what our gift is right now, and then to pick a lane and go. Pick a lane, find your people, don't try to do it alone. And we kind of have to put our hands to this issue, to these issues of our times, as if we are the keystone species, because we are, and what it would mean to regenerate our whole ecosystem. And that can look like many things. That's the beautiful thing about a system, is there are many points of intervention. And these things are, none of us, unless you all are psychic, know what the future holds fully. And I always come back to that in the sense of like, the opposite of despair is not some like, Candyland la optimism. For me, the opposite of despair is actually putting yourself in action. And a lot of motivation actually doesn't come before action. You have to do the action and motivation will come. So I'm telling people like, find your lane. If lawyering is it, oh my gosh, do that to the best of your ability with people, real people at the center. And what that could do, put out a lot of resources in the chat today. I think that's a big one. And then even not on a personal level, right? Like, what does it mean to find the practices that give you hope to stay in for the long term? That this is not about trying to do all the things at once and burn ourselves out, but what it means to actually make the light work by more hands make the light work, right? So I tell people to find their community and get in. And one particular example I will leave you with that is a constant light that I shine wherever I can is we organize young people in Richmond, California. Like I said, I've been talking about Richmond a lot today. And there is, if any of you get to visit it, there is what the kids call a liberation and climate resiliency hub at the Rise Commons. We did it with the Richmond Youth Organizing Group, amazing group. And basically it is a center, a beautiful building and grounds that was designed by the youth by talking with their family members and each other about what do they need in their community and in times of disaster and in times of not. And they built it. So if you want to look at the Rise Commons, that's RYSE, that is a beacon of hope for me. And I tell people, how do we not wait for a future we want, but actually build it now? And that there are people doing it. And that for a lot of us who come from immigrant refugee families, it's like our ancestors have been through a lot to get us here. And we are called to this moment to say, this is our time to get through this hard moment that we're trying to do for the folks that are coming after us. And so I tell people, it's there if you want to find it. It's there if you want to find it. And I hope that everybody stays in long enough and keeps the practices up that you need to keep you in it and stay in connection to each other. I think that's the hardest part post-pandemic is it's very easy to think we're isolated, but we're not.
Thank you, Christine. A lot of what you said recalls for me one of my favorite quotes from this hour, which was yours earlier in the hour, and then it's that hope is a discipline. So I really appreciate those thoughts. And I know that they also go partly toward answering our one last question in the chat, which is from Jessica about how to position yourself if you're passionate about being an environmental lawyer and climate justice lawyer. Jessica, I invite you, first of all, to reach out to me directly or to any of our Emmett Institute or other colleagues at UCLA Law, and we can talk directly about that. But you've had an awful lot of good advice from these fantastic panelists too about that issue. I want to ask everybody to join me in thanking Christine and Lindsay. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm so grateful that you spent this hour with us. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our students did too. So thanks so much. I appreciate it. It was wonderful chatting with you all.
Thanks so much, Cara.
Thank you.
And I believe
right.
Maria Makava said that. I don't want to take somebody's words.
Okay, yes. Good attribution. All right, folks, be well.